Have you ever wondered what you would do if the people closest to you betrayed you in the most cruel way possible? What happens when generosity meets ingratitude? I lived this nightmare firsthand, and I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. My life seemed normal, like any other devoted wife and mother, until the day I discovered that everything I believed about my family was a carefully constructed lie. What I saw in that moment changed everything I believed about loyalty, love, and the people I trusted most. If you've ever been used by someone you trusted, if you've ever discovered that your generosity was being exploited, then you'll understand every word I'm about to say. Watch my complete story and discover how I transformed the worst betrayal of my life into an unforgettable lesson about respect. Before I begin my account, I'd like to know where you're listening from. Share your city and country in the comments. Now I'm going to tell you everything from the beginning. My name is Helena, I'm 52 years old, and I live in Dallas, Texas. For 30 years, I believed that the love and loyalty I gave to my husband, Augustus, would be my greatest legacy. We started from nothing, going through nights of hunger and debt, until we built an empire that supported not only our children, but his entire family as well. I saw myself as the silent guardian, the invisible gear that kept everything running. I worked alongside Augustus, managing the administrative side of our construction business, while he handled the field operations. Every morning, I woke up at 5 to prepare breakfast for him and our two sons, Daniel and Raphael, then spent my days managing accounts, dealing with suppliers, and ensuring our employees were paid on time. I never asked for recognition because I thought love didn't need acknowledgement. I thought my dedication spoke for itself. Augustus always praised me in public, calling me his right hand and the foundation of everything we built together. When business associates asked about our success, he would smile and say that none of it would have been possible without me. I felt proud, valued, complete. Our house in the suburbs became the gathering place for his entire extended family. Every Sunday, I prepared lunch for 15 to 20 people. His mother, his 3 sisters, their children, everyone came to our table. I never complained about the expense or the work because I believed I was building something beautiful, a united family where everyone felt welcome and supported. My relationship with our sons was equally important to me. Daniel, now 28, had always been the responsible one, the one Augustus said would inherit the business leadership. Since he was 15, Daniel spent summers working with his father, learning every aspect of construction. He was serious, focused, with a natural ability for numbers and negotiations. Raphael, 25, was different, more sensitive, artistic, studying architecture. Augustus sometimes worried that Raphael wasn't tough enough for business, but I always defended him, saying that diversity of talent strengthened any family. The first signs that something was wrong appeared about 6 months before Augustus's death. He started having frequent meetings that he couldn't discuss with me, claiming they involved sensitive negotiations that required absolute secrecy. When I asked if I could help with anything, he would kiss my forehead and say that some things were too complicated for me to worry about. At first, I felt protected by his concern. Later, I realized it was the beginning of my exclusion from decisions about our own life. Augustus began traveling more frequently, sometimes staying away for 3 or 4 days for what he called expansion meetings. When I offered to accompany him, he said these were business trips, not vacation, and that I would be bored. I trusted him completely. After all, in 30 years of marriage, he had never given me reasons to doubt his faithfulness. Our intimate life remained active. He continued calling me my love and asking about my day. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible to someone who had no reason to suspect anything. The change in Daniel's behavior was equally gradual. He began having private conversations with his father, conversations that stopped when I entered the room. When I asked what they were discussing, both would smile and say it was surprise business plans or ideas for the future. I felt momentarily excluded, but thought it was natural for father and son to have their confidential business discussions. Daniel had always been respectful to me, calling me every day to ask how I was, bringing flowers on Mother's Day, remembering my birthday with thoughtful gifts. Raphael, on the other hand, seemed increasingly distant and troubled. I noticed he was drinking more, sometimes arriving home with glazed eyes and the smell of alcohol. When I tried to talk to him about it, he would become defensive, saying that everyone was pressuring him to be something he wasn't. I thought it was normal stress from a young man trying to find his place in the family business. Augustus dismissed my concerns, saying that Raphael just needed to mature and take responsibility. The construction business was thriving. We had contracts for 3 major residential developments and 2 commercial projects. Our bank account showed steady growth, and Augustus talked enthusiastically about expanding to other cities in Texas. I managed all the administrative documentation, from permits to payroll, so I had complete visibility into the company's financial health. Everything seemed solid, prosperous, promising. What I didn't know was that there were movements and decisions happening parallel to what I could see in areas of the business that Augustus had gradually removed from my oversight. About 3 months before his death, Augustus began insisting that I deserved to rest more, and that he would handle certain administrative aspects that had always been my responsibility. He hired a new accountant, Margaret, a woman in her early 40s whom he described as extremely competent and trustworthy. When I met Margaret, she seemed professional and friendly, but I noticed that she and Augustus had a working dynamic that seemed almost intimate. They exchanged glances that lasted a bit too long, laughed at inside jokes I didn't understand, and had frequent private meetings in his office. When I mentioned my discomfort with this new dynamic, Augustus accused me of being jealous and possessive. He said I was imagining things because I wasn't used to sharing business responsibilities with other people. I felt ashamed of my own suspicions and forced myself to trust his explanation. After all, Margaret was just an employee, and Augustus had never given me concrete reasons to doubt his fidelity. I convinced myself that my discomfort was unfounded, perhaps a sign that I really was too controlling about business matters. The last months of Augustus's life were a period of apparent normalcy, mixed with subtle tensions I couldn't fully identify. He continued being affectionate with me, planning a trip to Europe for our 30th wedding anniversary, talking about retirement and grandchildren. But there were moments when I caught him staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Sometimes it seemed like guilt, other times like pity, and occasionally like someone looking at a person he was about to say goodbye to forever. On the night Augustus died, I was sleeping peacefully beside him. We had spent the evening watching television together, discussing Daniel's recent engagement and Raphael's progress in his architecture studies. Augustus seemed relaxed, even happy. He kissed me goodnight and said he loved me, just like he had done thousands of times before. At around 3 a.m, I woke up feeling that something was wrong. Augustus was breathing irregularly, with a sound I had never heard before. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. The doctor said it had been a massive heart attack, quick and painless. In the midst of my grief, I felt grateful that he hadn't suffered. The funeral was a manifestation of the love and respect Augustus had earned throughout his life. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects: employees, business associates, neighbors, family friends. I received countless expressions of condolence and support. Everyone talked about what a good man Augustus had been, how he had helped so many people, how his legacy would live on through the business and the family he had built. I felt proud, even in the midst of pain, knowing that I had been married to someone so universally loved and respected. During the funeral preparations, Daniel took charge of all the practical arrangements with an efficiency that impressed me. He coordinated with the funeral home, organized the reception, managed the logistics with a competence that made me realize how much he had matured. Raphael, on the other hand, seemed lost, almost in shock, drinking more than usual and avoiding conversations about practical matters. I thought it was just different ways of processing grief. Some people become hyperactive when facing loss, others shut down emotionally. Margaret attended the funeral and offered her help with any business matters that needed immediate attention. She seemed genuinely sorry for my loss and assured me that she would do everything possible to keep the company running smoothly during this difficult transition. She mentioned that Augustus had left detailed instructions about operations and that everything was well organized for continuity. At the time, I interpreted this as evidence of Augustus's foresight and care for our family's future. The reading of the will was scheduled for 1 week after the funeral, enough time for immediate family members to gather and for emotions to settle a bit. Augustus's lawyer, Robert Mitchell, had been our family attorney for over 15 years and was someone I trusted completely. He had handled the purchase of our house, business contracts, and had always been transparent and honest in all our dealings. When he called to schedule the reading, his tone seemed more formal than usual, but I attributed this to the solemnity of the occasion. On the morning of the will reading, I woke up with a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation. I knew that Augustus had always promised that I would be well taken care of, and that the business would be divided between our sons. We had discussed this many times over the years, and he had always assured me that I would never have to worry about financial security. I dressed carefully, choosing a black suit that Augustus had always said made me look elegant and strong. I wanted to honor his memory by presenting myself with the dignity he had always admired in me. The law office was located in downtown Dallas, in one of those imposing buildings that convey seriousness and tradition. As I walked through the marble lobby, I remembered all the times Augustus and I had been there together, signing documents, planning our future, building our life step by step. The receptionist greeted me with sincere condolences and guided me to the conference room where the reading would take place. The room was formal but comfortable, with dark wood furniture and law books lining the walls. Daniel arrived a few minutes after me, impeccably dressed and composed. He hugged me and asked how I was feeling, showing the same care and respect he had always demonstrated. Raphael arrived shortly after, obviously struggling with a hangover, but making an effort to appear presentable. Augustus's sister Clara was also present, along with his elderly mother Doña Mercedes, who had insisted on attending despite her fragile health. Margaret was there too, which surprised me a bit, but Robert explained that she needed to be present due to business matters mentioned in the will. Robert began the reading with the standard legal formalities, explaining the document's validity and the legal context of its provisions. His voice was steady and professional, but I noticed that he avoided making direct eye contact with me. The first provisions were predictable: small bequests to employees, donations to charities Augustus supported, specific items for family members. Doña Mercedes received the house where Augustus had grown up, along with a fund for her care. Clara received a sum that would ensure her financial comfort. Everything seemed normal and fair. Then came the moment that changed my life forever. Robert paused, took a deep breath, and began reading the section about the main estate. The house where we had lived for 20 years, the construction business we had built together, the bank accounts, the investments, everything, absolutely everything, was left to Margaret Sullivan. Not Margaret the accountant, but Margaret Sullivan, described in the document as my beloved companion and the mother of my daughter, Sarah Sullivan, whom I recognize as my legitimate heir. The silence in the room was deafening. I felt as if the air had been sucked out of my lungs, as if the world had stopped spinning. The words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't process their meaning. Margaret, the accountant I had trusted, was Augustus's lover. Not only that, but they had a daughter together, a daughter he recognized as his heir. I looked at Daniel, expecting to see the same shock I was feeling, but his expression was strangely controlled, almost resigned. It was as if he already knew. "There must be some mistake," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "This can't be right. Augustus would never we discussed this so many times. He promised." Robert looked at me with what seemed like genuine compassion and said that the document was authentic, dated just 3 months before Augustus's death, and properly witnessed and notarized. He explained that I had the right to contest the will, but that everything appeared to be in perfect legal order. Margaret remained silent during this entire exchange, but I noticed that her eyes were filled with tears. Whether from sadness or guilt, I couldn't tell. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm but distant. "Mom, I think we need to talk privately after this." Raphael, on the other hand, seemed about to explode. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair, and shouted, "This is impossible! Dad wouldn't do this to Mom. There has to be an explanation." Clara, always dramatic, began crying loudly, saying that the family was cursed and that nothing would ever be the same. In that moment, I needed to pause in my account to ask you something important. Have you ever felt that deep pain when you discovered that someone you trusted was using you? That feeling of having been too naive, too generous? I know that many of you have been through similar situations and carry these scars in silence. If you felt touched by this part of my story, share your experience in the comments. It can be something simple like, "I was also betrayed by family and learned to set boundaries." Each of your comments is not just a way to vent, but a light that guides someone who might be going through this now and thinks they're alone. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And together, we form a support network stronger than any manipulation. The revelation about the inheritance was just the beginning of discovering a web of lies that had been woven around me for years. As the initial shock began to subside, questions started forming in my mind. How long had this relationship between Augustus and Margaret been going on? How old was this daughter I knew nothing about? How had they managed to keep this secret in a city where everyone knew our family? And most disturbing of all, what role had Daniel played in all of this, given his apparent lack of surprise? After the will reading, Daniel insisted that we go to a nearby cafe to talk privately. Raphael, still in shock, said he needed to be alone and left without saying where he was going. I was worried about him, but Daniel assured me that he would call him later. Clara and Doña Mercedes left together, both crying and making dramatic comments about family betrayal. Margaret approached me before leaving and, with tears in her eyes, said she was sorry for my pain and that she hoped we could talk when I was ready. I couldn't respond. I was still too stunned to process what had happened. In the cafe, Daniel ordered coffee for both of us, but neither of us touched our cups. He sat across from me, taking my hands in his, and began to speak with a gentleness I hadn't heard since he was a child. "Mom, I need to tell you something that's going to hurt, but you need to know the truth. I've known about Margaret and Sarah for about 2 years. Dad told me because he wanted me to understand the family situation before making any major decisions about the business. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. 2 years? I whispered. You've known for 2 years and never told me anything? Daniel looked down, clearly struggling with guilt. Dad made me promise not to say anything. He said he was trying to find the best way to handle the situation, that he didn't want to hurt you unnecessarily. He said that Margaret was just a phase, that he was confused but that he loved you and would never leave you. I believed him, Mom. I really believed he was going to end things with her, and that none of this would ever come to light. But there's a daughter, Daniel. A daughter he recognized as his heir. This isn't just an affair. It's a parallel life he built behind my back. Sarah is 12 years old, Daniel continued, his voice barely audible. She looks exactly like Dad when he was young. There's no doubt she's his daughter. Margaret started working for us when she was already pregnant, but she never said who the father was. Dad only told me the truth 2 years ago, when Sarah started asking questions about her father, and Margaret threatened to reveal everything if he didn't take responsibility. I tried to process this information, but everything seemed surreal. And the business? The will? How is it possible that everything is in her name? That's what I don't understand either, Daniel admitted. The last time Dad and I talked about succession, he said that I would inherit the business and that you would receive the house and a significant part of the investments. He never mentioned changing the will to benefit Margaret. Something happened in the last few months that made him change his mind completely. We sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, I asked the question that terrified me most. Do you think there's something more to this story? Something we don't know yet? Daniel hesitated before answering. Mom, there are some things that don't add up. In the last few months, Dad was making financial decisions without consulting me, even though he had always included me in everything related to the business. He was having meetings with people I didn't know, and when I asked about it, he said they were confidential matters that he would explain later. He also seemed nervous, almost scared, which wasn't like him at all. Scared of what? I don't know. But I have a feeling that Margaret knows more than she's letting on. The way she acted during the will reading, it was as if she was expecting something different too. She seemed as surprised as we were, but also relieved. It's hard to explain. As we left the cafe, Daniel promised that he would help me investigate what had really happened. He said that as Augustus's son, he had the right to access certain business documents and that we could try to understand the sequence of events that led to this shocking change in the will. However, he also warned me that Margaret now had legal control over everything, and that any investigation would have to be done carefully to avoid legal complications. That night, alone in the house that was no longer mine, I walked through the rooms where I had lived for 20 years, touching objects that held decades of memories. Every photo, every piece of furniture, every corner held a story of the life I thought I had built with Augustus. But now, everything seemed contaminated by the lie I had been living. How could I have been so blind? How could the man who slept beside me every night, who told me he loved me every day, maintain a parallel relationship for over 12 years? I tried to remember signs that I might have missed, conversations that might have had double meanings, behaviors that might have indicated deception. But honestly, until the very end, Augustus had been the same loving and attentive husband he had always been. This made the betrayal even more devastating. It wasn't that our relationship had deteriorated or that he had become cold and distant. He had simply managed to live 2 lives simultaneously, giving love and attention to 2 different families without either of us knowing about the other's existence. The following days were a blur of legal consultations, phone calls with family members, and attempts to understand my new reality. Robert recommended that I hire an independent attorney to review the will and explore possibilities for contesting it. He also suggested that I request a complete audit of the business's finances to ensure there hadn't been any irregularities in the management of assets that legally belonged to me as Augustus's spouse. The lawyer I hired, Patricia Williams, was a specialist in family law and inheritance disputes. After reviewing all the documents, she explained that contesting the will would be an uphill battle, but not impossible. The fact that Augustus had made such a drastic change in his testamentary dispositions without discussing it with me could indicate that he was under some kind of pressure or undue influence. However, proving this would require concrete evidence, not just suspicions. Patricia also explained my rights as a surviving spouse under Texas law. Even though Augustus had left everything to Margaret, I had the right to claim a portion of the marital assets, especially those that had been acquired during our marriage with both of our efforts. The construction business, the house, most of the investments, all of this could be considered marital property, regardless of what the will said. While I was trying to understand my legal options, I was also dealing with the emotional impact of the betrayal on our family. Raphael had disappeared for 3 days after the will reading, and when he finally came home, he was clearly under the influence of alcohol and prescription medications. He was devastated, not just by his father's death, but by the discovery that the man he had admired and tried to please his entire life had been living a lie. "How could he do this to you, Mom?" Raphael cried, hugging me tightly. "You gave him everything. You sacrificed your own dreams to support his business. You took care of his family. You were the perfect wife, and he repays you by leaving everything to his lover? It's not fair. It's not right." Daniel was dealing with the situation differently. He seemed determined to find logical explanations, to understand the business and legal aspects of what had happened. But I could see that he was also struggling with the moral implications of his father's actions and his own role in keeping the secret. The guilt was eating him up inside, and our relationship, which had always been close and trusting, was now marked by tension and mutual hurt. It was during this emotionally chaotic period that I made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. I decided that I needed to meet Sarah, Augustus's daughter, with Margaret. I needed to see with my own eyes this child who had inherited what should have been my son's legacy. I needed to understand who she was, what kind of relationship she had with her father, and perhaps most importantly, what Margaret had told her about our family. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Margaret called me 3 days after the will reading, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. She said she understood how devastated I must be, and that she wanted to explain everything that had happened. She suggested we meet at a neutral location, a small cafe in downtown Dallas, where we could talk without interruption. Against Daniel's advice, who thought it was too soon and potentially dangerous for my emotional state, I agreed to meet her. When I arrived at the cafe, Margaret was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a young girl who could only be Sarah. My heart stopped when I saw her. Daniel had been right. She looked exactly like Augustus at that age. She had his dark curly hair, his intense brown eyes, even his way of tilting her head when she was thinking. It was like seeing a female version of my late husband, and the resemblance was so striking that I felt dizzy for a moment. Margaret stood up when she saw me, her face pale and her hands visibly shaking. "Helena, thank you for coming. I know this is incredibly difficult for you. Sarah, this is Helena. This is Augustus's wife." The girl looked at me with curious eyes, without the hostility or awkwardness I had expected. "Hello," she said politely. "I'm sorry about my daddy's death. Mommy told me that you loved him very much too." Those simple words from a 12-year-old girl hit me harder than any legal document could have. The innocence in her voice, the way she called Augustus daddy, the recognition that I had also loved him, all of this made me realize that Sarah was as much a victim in this situation as I was. She hadn't chosen to be born into this complex web of secrets and lies. "Yes, sweetheart," I managed to say, sitting down across from them. "I loved your daddy very much, and I'm sure he loved you very much too." Margaret began to cry silently, and through her tears, she started telling me a story that was even more complicated than I had imagined. She had met Augustus 7 years ago, not 5 as I had thought, when she was going through a difficult divorce and struggling to make ends meet as a single mother. Sarah wasn't Augustus's biological daughter at all. "What?" I whispered, confused. "But the will. He recognized her as his heir." "That's the part I need to explain," Margaret said, glancing nervously at Sarah, who was distracted coloring in a notebook. "Sarah's biological father abandoned us when she was 3 years old. Augustus met us when I was working as a waitress at a restaurant he frequented during his business trips. He was kind to Sarah from the beginning, and she became attached to him. When he offered me the accounting job at your company, I thought it was just professional kindness." Margaret explained that the relationship between her and Augustus had developed slowly, over the course of 3 years. He would visit them occasionally, bringing gifts for Sarah, helping with household expenses, acting like a father figure. Sarah began calling him Daddy, naturally, and Augustus never corrected her. When Margaret got pregnant again 2 years ago, Augustus had insisted that the child should be considered his, even though paternity tests had never been done. "Wait," I interrupted, feeling more confused than ever. "Pregnant again? Where is this other child?" Margaret's face crumpled with grief. "I lost the baby at 6 months. Augustus was devastated. He said that losing that child made him realize how much he loved Sarah and how much he wanted to protect her future. That's when he started talking about changing his will. I tried to process this information, but nothing made sense. But Margaret, if Sarah isn't his biological daughter, why would he leave everything to you both? Why wouldn't he leave anything to Daniel and Raphael, his actual sons?" Margaret looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might be listening. Helena, there are things about Augustus that I think you didn't know. In the last year of his life, he was being pressured by some people, business associates who weren't exactly legitimate. He owed money to the wrong kind of people, and they were threatening not just him, but his family. This revelation hit me like a bolt of lightning. What kind of people? What money? I don't know all the details because Augustus tried to protect me from the worst of it, but apparently some of the recent construction projects involved investors who weren't what they seemed. Augustus had borrowed money to expand the business faster than was safe, and when some projects fell through, he couldn't pay back what he owed. These people started threatening him, saying they would hurt his family if he didn't find a way to pay. Margaret explained that Augustus had been desperate to find a solution that would protect his legitimate family while satisfying his creditors. The idea of transferring assets to Margaret and Sarah, who appeared to have no connection to the business debts, was supposedly a way to preserve something for the future while keeping his real family safe from retaliation. But that doesn't explain why he didn't tell me any of this, I said, feeling a mixture of anger and confusion. If he was trying to protect us, why leave me completely in the dark? Because he was ashamed, Margaret replied. He told me that you had always believed in him, always trusted his business decisions, and he couldn't bear the thought of admitting that he had made such serious mistakes. He was convinced he could find a solution without you ever having to know about the problems. I looked at Sarah, who was still coloring peacefully, oblivious to the conversation that was determining her future. This innocent child had been used as a pawn in a game she didn't understand, just like I had been. The difference was that I was an adult who could fight back, while she was just a little girl who had lost the only father figure she had ever known. Margaret, I need to ask you something directly, I said, leaning forward. Do you love Augustus, or was this relationship just convenient for you? Margaret was quiet for a long moment before answering. I loved him, Helena. Not in the same way you loved him, because I always knew I was sharing him with you. But I loved his kindness, his generosity, the way he treated Sarah like she was his own daughter. Augustus made me feel safe and valued at a time in my life when I felt completely lost and alone. I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger at the betrayal, sadness for the situation, but also a kind of understanding of Margaret's position. She had been a vulnerable single mother who had found security and love with a man who seemed to genuinely care about her and her daughter. She hadn't set out to destroy a marriage or steal a family's inheritance. She had simply tried to build a life for herself and her child with the resources available to her. However, understanding Margaret's motivations didn't solve the practical problems I was facing. I was still a 52-year-old woman who had lost everything she thought belonged to her, and I still had 2 sons whose inheritance had been given to people who weren't even blood relatives. Margaret, I need to be completely honest with you, I said. I understand your situation, and I don't blame you for trying to protect Sarah, but I have my own children to think about, and I have my own life to rebuild. I'm going to fight this will, and I'm going to do everything legally possible to recover what rightfully belongs to my family. Margaret nodded, as if she had expected this. I understand, Helena. I want you to know that I never asked Augustus to leave everything to us. When the lawyer read the will, I was as surprised as you were. I had expected maybe a small inheritance for Sarah, something to help with her education, but never imagined it would be everything. Before we parted ways, Margaret made me a proposal that I hadn't expected. She said that she didn't feel comfortable keeping the house where I had lived for 20 years, and that she would be willing to sell it back to me at fair market value if I could arrange financing. She also said that she had no interest in actively managing the construction business and would consider selling her shares if the legal disputes could be resolved amicably. Why would you do that? I asked, suspicious of her apparent generosity. Because I want to do what's right, Margaret replied. And because Augustus told me more than once how much he loved you and how guilty he felt about the situation he had created. I think he would want me to find a way to be fair to everyone involved. When I returned home that evening, I found Daniel waiting for me in the living room. He had a serious expression and several documents spread out on the coffee table. Mom, I've been investigating Dad's business dealings from the last year, and I found some things you need to see. Daniel had used his access to company records to trace financial transactions from the months before Augustus's death. What he discovered was alarming. Augustus had indeed borrowed large sums of money from sources that weren't traditional banks or legitimate lenders. The money had been used to finance construction projects that had run into serious problems due to permit issues, environmental complications, and cost overruns. Mom, we're talking about debts of over $2 million to people who don't appear in any business registry or legal documentation. Dad was paying interest rates of 25% annually, which is illegal in Texas. These people aren't just loan sharks. They're part of organized crime networks. I felt the ground disappearing beneath my feet. Daniel, if this is true, then we're all in danger. These people won't disappear just because Augustus is dead. That's exactly what I'm worried about, Daniel admitted. I think Dad changed the will not just to protect his assets, but to protect us. If everything legally belongs to Margaret and Sarah, then technically we have nothing these people can take from us. We spent the next several hours reviewing documents and trying to understand the full scope of the financial problems Augustus had hidden from us. The more we discovered, the more I realized that my husband's betrayal was even more complex than a simple extramarital affair. He had been living in a nightmare of debt and threats, trying to juggle multiple crises while maintaining the appearance of normalcy for his family. However, this new information also raised disturbing questions about Daniel's role in recent events. If the financial problems were as serious as they appeared, how was it possible that Daniel, who worked closely with his father in the business, hadn't noticed anything unusual? Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, I said, looking directly into his eyes. How much did you really know about these financial problems, and when did you know it? Daniel hesitated, and in that moment of silence, I saw the truth in his expression. He had known much more than he had admitted. Mom, I suspected something was wrong about 6 months ago, when Dad started making decisions without consulting me, and when we began receiving visits from people who didn't seem like normal business associates. But every time I asked direct questions, Dad would say that everything was under control and that I shouldn't worry. But you kept investigating on your own, didn't you? Yes, Daniel admitted, his voice barely audible. I hired a private investigator to look into some of the people Dad was meeting with. That's how I discovered the connection to organized crime and the extent of the debts. When I confronted Dad with this information, he broke down and told me everything. About the money, about the threats, about Margaret and Sarah, and about his plan to transfer assets to protect us. I felt a wave of anger unlike anything I had ever experienced. And you agreed with this plan? You thought it was acceptable to leave me completely in the dark while you and your father decided my future behind my back? Mom, I was scared, Daniel said, tears streaming down his face. These people had threatened to hurt Raphael, to hurt you, to destroy everything Dad had built. I thought that if we could find a way to pay the debts and protect the family at the same time, everything would work out eventually. I never imagined that Dad would die before we could fix everything. The next few days were a whirlwind of revelations, legal consultations, and family confrontations. Raphael, when he learned about the organized crime connections, went into a complete panic and started talking about leaving the state until things calmed down. Clara and Doña Mercedes were terrified when they learned that the family might be in physical danger because of Augustus's debts. Patricia, my lawyer, explained that the situation was much more complicated than a simple inheritance dispute. If Augustus had indeed transferred assets to avoid paying legitimate debts, those transfers could be considered fraudulent and could be reversed by the courts. However, if the creditors were criminal organizations, involving the courts could put everyone in danger. Helena, you need to understand that we're no longer just dealing with family law, Patricia said during one of our meetings. We're potentially dealing with criminal law, bankruptcy law, and possibly even witness protection issues. Before we proceed with any legal action, we need to fully understand who these creditors are and what they're capable of. It was at this point that I made the decision that would define everything that followed. I decided that I would not run away, I would not hide, and I would not allow criminals to decide my family's future. I had spent 30 years being the supportive wife, the silent partner, the woman who trusted others to make the important decisions. Now, for the first time in my life, I was going to take control of my own destiny. I called Margaret and asked for another meeting, but this time I wanted to include Daniel and, if possible, some of the people who had been pressuring Augustus. I wanted to understand exactly who we were dealing with and what they really wanted. If Augustus had made agreements that affected my family's future, then I wanted to be part of negotiating a solution. Margaret was terrified by my proposal. Helena, you don't understand how dangerous these people are. Augustus kept you away from them precisely because he was trying to protect you. If you get involved directly, you could be putting yourself and your sons in mortal danger. Margaret, I'm already in danger, I replied. The difference is that now I want to face it with my eyes open instead of living in ignorance. If there's a way to solve this situation that protects everyone, including you and Sarah, then I want to find it, but I won't do it from the shadows anymore. The meeting was arranged for the following Friday at a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown hotel. Margaret would be there with a representative of the people Augustus owed money to. Daniel would accompany me, and both Patricia and a security consultant she had recommended would also be present. Raphael chose not to attend, saying he was too scared to face the reality of the situation. When I walked into that conference room, I was more nervous than I had ever been in my life, but I was also more determined. I was about to meet the people who had been manipulating my family's life from the shadows, and I was going to find out what it would take to free us from their influence. The man who represented Augustus's creditors was not what I had expected. Instead of a stereotypical criminal, he was a well-dressed middle-aged man who could have been any business executive. He introduced himself as Mr. Torres and spoke with the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to complex negotiations. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "I'm sorry for your loss. Augustus was a man we respected, and his death has created complications for everyone involved." "Mr. Torres, I'll be direct," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want to understand exactly what my husband owed you, what the terms of payment are, and what options exist for resolving the situation in a way that protects my family." Mr. Torres opened a briefcase and pulled out several documents. "The total debt is $2.3 million, including accumulated interest. Your husband had agreed to a payment plan that involved transferring certain assets to trusted third parties, who would then manage those assets to generate the necessary funds for payment. And Margaret and Sarah were supposed to be those trusted third parties?" "Exactly. The idea was that Mrs. Margaret would sell the business assets gradually and use the proceeds to pay the debt over 5 years. In exchange, your family would be free from any direct obligation and could maintain a portion of the assets through a separate agreement with Mrs. Margaret." I looked at Margaret, who seemed uncomfortable with being the center of this discussion. "And you agreed to this arrangement, Margaret?" "I didn't have much choice," Margaret replied. "Augustus explained that it was the only way to protect everyone, and I trusted his judgment. But now that he's gone, I don't know if I'm capable of managing a business I don't understand while dealing with obligations I never wanted." It was at this moment that I made the proposal that would change everything. "Mr. Torres, what if I told you that there might be a better way to handle this situation? A way that would guarantee you get paid faster and more securely than the original plan?" Mr. Torres raised an eyebrow, clearly interested. "I'm listening. I've been managing the administrative side of my husband's business for 20 years. I know every client, every supplier, every ongoing project. If you're willing to work with me directly instead of through Margaret, I can guarantee that the business continues operating efficiently and generating the revenue needed to pay the debt." "But Mrs. Sullivan," Patricia interrupted, "that would mean taking on a personal obligation for debts that legally aren't yours." "Patricia, these debts may not be legally mine, but they're affecting my family's future whether I accept that responsibility or not. If I can take control of the situation instead of being a victim of it, then that's what I'm going to do." Mr. Torres was silent for several minutes, apparently considering my proposal. Finally, he said, "Mrs. Sullivan, your husband told us that you were a remarkable woman, but that you preferred to stay in the background. It seems he underestimated your capabilities." "Mr. Torres, my husband made many mistakes in the last few years of his life, but his biggest mistake was thinking that protecting me meant keeping me ignorant. I'm not a fragile woman who needs to be sheltered from difficult realities. I'm a woman who has spent 30 years building a business and a family, and I'm perfectly capable of solving the problems that others have created." The negotiation that followed was intense and complex. We spent the next 4 hours discussing terms, guarantees, timelines, and contingencies. In the end, we reached an agreement that was better for everyone involved than the original plan Augustus had negotiated. Under the new arrangement, I would take direct control of the construction business and the associated assets. Margaret would retain ownership of the family house and a cash inheritance sufficient to ensure Sarah's future education and well-being, but she would be free from any obligation related to the business debts. The debt would be paid over 3 years instead of 5, using revenue from ongoing projects and the strategic sale of certain assets. Most importantly, Mr. Torres agreed that once the payment plan was formalized, his organization would have no further contact with any member of my family. We would be free from threats, surveillance, and any other form of intimidation. When I left that meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope that the problems could be solved, but hope that I could be the one to solve them. For the first time since Augustus's death, I felt like I had agency in my own life. Daniel was amazed by what had transpired. "Mom, I can't believe you just negotiated directly with those people and came out with a better deal than Dad had managed to get." "Daniel, your father was operating from a position of fear and guilt. He was trying to hide his mistakes instead of facing them directly. Fear makes people accept bad deals because they're desperate for any solution. I wasn't operating from fear. I was operating from determination." The following weeks were intensive as we worked to formalize all the legal agreements. Patricia had to coordinate with multiple lawyers to ensure that the asset transfers were done properly and that all parties' interests were protected. Margaret proved to be cooperative and honest throughout the process, and I began to understand that she was as much a victim of circumstances as I was. Raphael, when he learned about the resolution, had a mixed reaction. He was relieved that the immediate danger was over, but he was also resentful that important decisions about the family's future had been made without his input. Mom, I understand that you were trying to protect everyone, but don't you think I deserve to know what was happening with my own family? Raphael, you're absolutely right, I admit. I made the same mistake your father made. I tried to protect you by keeping you in the dark. From now on, if decisions affect this family, we make them together. Sarah adapted to the changes with the resilience that children often show in difficult situations. Margaret decided to move to another city to give everyone space to rebuild their lives, but she maintained contact so that Sarah could visit occasionally and maintain the relationship she had developed with Daniel and Raphael, who had grown fond of their little sister. As I took control of the construction business, I discovered that Augustus had been a better businessman than his recent problems suggested. The company had solid foundations, good employees, and ongoing projects that were profitable once the debt pressures were removed. Within 6 months, we were not only meeting the payment plan obligations, but actually expanding into new markets. But the most important change was in how I saw myself. For 30 years, I had defined myself primarily as Augustus's wife and Daniel and Raphael's mother. Now, for the first time, I was discovering who Helena really was, when she wasn't defined by her relationships with other people. I was discovering that I was smarter, stronger, and more capable than I had ever imagined. The construction business thrived under my leadership. I implemented administrative systems that Augustus had never considered, established partnerships with suppliers that reduced costs, and diversified our services to include renovation and commercial projects. The employees, who had initially been skeptical about working for the boss's widow, quickly learned to respect my competence and leadership. More importantly, I learned to set boundaries and demand respect in all areas of my life. When Clara tried to manipulate me into supporting her financially, as she had done with Augustus for years, I clearly explained that our relationship would be cordial, but that I wasn't responsible for subsidizing her lifestyle. When potential romantic interests approached me with obvious intentions of taking advantage of my financial success, I politely but firmly declined. Daniel chose to continue working in the family business, but now as my partner, rather than as the heir apparent. Our relationship became more honest and egalitarian, based on mutual respect rather than traditional family hierarchy. Raphael decided to complete his architecture studies and eventually joined the company as well, bringing creative ideas that complemented the traditional construction services. The debt to Mr. Torres's organization was paid off in 2.5 years, 6 months ahead of schedule. On the day I made the final payment, I felt a sense of liberation that went far beyond simple financial relief. I had not only solved the problems that Augustus had left behind, but I had also proven to myself that I was capable of facing any challenge life might present. If these stories touch your heart, if you've felt the weight of family betrayal or know someone who has gone through this channel is a space created for people like you. By subscribing, you're not just following stories, you're joining a community that understands that setting boundaries is an act of self-love. With each new story shared, we seek not only to expose family injustices, but to celebrate the strength and intelligence that exists in each of us. Our commitment is to bring weekly narratives that inspire, strengthen, and show that none of us need to accept being disrespected by family. Click subscribe now and activate the bell to be the first to receive our stories of overcoming. You deserve to have your dignity respected and find strength in each new decision.